Cathara 7 had 2 moons, 3 kinds of rain, and approximately 1 good reason to live on it, depending on who you asked. The colonial administration said the reason was opportunity. The settlement engineers said it was the mineral-rich river basin. Elliot Voss, logistics coordinator for Outreach Bravo, would have said it was copper, because without the dog the planet was just a collection of inconveniences with interesting cloud formations. He had moved here at 34 with 2 cargo allotments, a logistics certification that had taken him 6 years to earn, and a Chesapeake Bay retriever who had taken the news of interstellar relocation with a philosophical calm that Elliot envied deeply. The transit ship had been 6 months of recycled air and synthetic meals, and a cryogenic adjacent suspension program that the brochure described as restorative and Elliot would describe, with the benefit of experience, as waking up feeling like a document that had been faxed badly. Copper had emerged from his transit pod, sneezed once, looked at the wall, and then looked at Elliot with an expression that said, "All right, what's next?" That had been 2 years ago. Elliot still hadn't fully adjusted to the 31-hour days. Copper had adapted within a week, which Elliot considered a personal slight. Their life at Outreach Bravo had settled into the particular rhythms of a place that is not quite home yet, but is no longer strange. The settlement itself was a cluster of prefabricated structures arranged around a central supply hub, ringed on 3 sides by rust-colored ridgelines that turned extraordinary colors at sunset and remained merely dangerous the rest of the time. Elliot ran supply logistics between the hub and the outlying depots, which meant he spent a fair amount of time driving an all-terrain crawler across terrain that had not been designed with terrestrial vehicles in mind, filing manifests on a tablet that always seemed to need an update at the worst possible moment, and trying to explain to the colony's automated inventory system that yes, he understood the protein ration count was low, and no, he could not resolve this faster by submitting the same form a 5th time. Copper came on the supply runs. He sat in the crawler's passenger seat with his nose directed at the ventilation slot, sampling Cathara 7 air with the focused attention of a sommelier, occasionally sneezing at something the planet offered that he found substandard. It was, all things considered, a good life. Small, functional, genuinely good. The 3rd supply run of that particular month was a routine Eastern Ridge Depot run, notable only for the fact that the crawler's navigation system had started making a sound like a disappointed sigh whenever Elliot took the Ridge Trail, which he had reported to maintenance twice, and which maintenance had twice responded to by updating the complaint ticket to under review. Copper had ranged ahead along the path as he always did, a rust-colored shape moving in and out of the scrub growth with the purposeful energy of an animal conducting serious research. He ranged. He doubled back. He ranged again. This was normal. What was not normal was that, somewhere between the halfway marker and the Eastern Depot, he did not double back. Elliot gave it the benefit of the doubt for longer than he should have, which was itself a testament to how reliable Copper's returns had always been. The doubt had always, previously, been worth giving the benefit of. He finished the depot run. He drove the trail twice at low speed with the crawler's exterior speaker, playing the whistle pattern that Copper responded to like a contractual obligation. He got out and walked the scrub line calling the dog's name until his voice bounced off the ridgeline and came back to him, sounding more uncertain than he intended. He filed a preliminary alert on the settlement net before he was back inside the crawler, because the Eastern Ridge at dusk was not a place to be casual about missing warm-blooded animals, and Copper was warm-blooded and the only one Elliot had. By nightfall, the settlement's communication net had his alert pinned to the top of the community board, illustrated with a photograph of Copper sitting in the crawler's passenger seat, looking as though he had just made an excellent point. The text beneath it read, "Missing. Large rust-colored dog, male, Chesapeake Bay retriever, answers to Copper, also answers to Hay, also responds to the specific sound of a food packet being opened from a distance of approximately 40 meters. Last seen Eastern Ridge Trail. Reward offered. Please. The please had gone in at the last moment, and Elliot had decided to leave it because it was honest. 3 days of searching produced the specific exhaustion that belongs only to looking for something you are not finding. His neighbor Dara from the adjacent supply unit walked the South Trail with him on day 2 and said all the right things and brought him a hot meal he did not taste. The settlement's search coordinator, a careful man named Polov who had the delivery of someone accustomed to managing difficult information gently, sat with Elliot on the evening of day 3 and talked about Cathara 7 predator ecosystem in the careful language of a person not quite saying the thing they are saying. Elliot listened. He nodded where nodding seemed appropriate. He went home and sat in his kitchen in front of a cup of synthetic coffee that went cold without him noticing, and he watched the motion sensor feed on his door panel with the hollow, mechanical hope of a man who knows, rationally, that he is probably watching nothing, and who cannot, for reasons that have nothing to do with rationality, stop watching. The feed showed him the empty path. The twin moons crossed their slow arcs above the ridge. Cathara 7 made the sounds it always made at night, which were numerous and largely unidentifiable, and the empty kitchen held them both, the man and the sounds, without comment. At 2:07 in the morning, Elliot put his head down on his arms at the table, and the synthetic coffee went entirely cold, and Cathara 7's 31-hour day began, quietly, to run out. The motion sensor activated at 6:14 in the morning, and the chime it produced was the same neutral 3-note tone it used for everything. A delivery drone, a neighbor stopping by, a piece of loose debris blown against the porch railing by Cathara 7's habitual indifference to property. Elliot had heard it hundreds of times. He had never, before this particular morning, come off a kitchen chair like a man who had been launched. He hit the door panel in his socks, pulled up the external feed, and there was Copper. There he was, trotting up the path with his tail in full rotation, unhurt, untroubled, wearing the expression of a dog returning from an errand that had gone very well and who saw no compelling reason why anyone should be dramatic about the duration. His coat was matted with something that was probably Cathara 7 river clay, and he had a small scrape along his left shoulder that had already scabbed over, and he was alive. He was walking. He was heading for the front door with the certainty of an animal who has always lived here and intends to continue doing so. Elliot opened the door before Copper reached it. He went down to his knees on the path, which was cold and not forgiving about it, and Copper walked directly into his arms with the dignity of a retriever who accepts affection as the correct and appropriate response to his return. Elliot said several things into the dog's fur that he would not have said in front of anyone, and that Copper received with the patient grace of an animal, accustomed to being someone's entire emotional infrastructure. Then Copper stepped back, turned his head toward the path behind him, and looked at Elliot with the expression he used when he had brought something and wanted proper acknowledgement of the achievement. It was the same expression he used for retrieved sticks, intercepted delivery packages, and on one occasion that maintenance was still occasionally bringing up, an entire thermal conduit coupling that he had apparently found unattended near the East Water Junction, and decided to relocate. There was a pause, the kind of pause that the universe inserts between one version of things and the next. She came into the light carefully, the way a person moves when they are managing something they have decided not to show. She was tall, taller than Elliot by a margin that registered clearly even from his position on his knees on the path, and she moved with the deliberateness of someone redistributing their weight around a point of pain. Her clothing had been remarkable once. It was still remarkable in the way that wreckage can be remarkable. The fabric caught the pale early light with an iridescence that no colonial issue material had ever managed, shifting between gold and deep blue depending on which way she turned, though about a third of it was now redistributed across Cathara 7 Eastern Ridge in ways that appeared non-recoverable. Her face was structured along lines that the human eye filed in the first half-second under the category of familiar, and then, in the second half-second, quietly revised that filing under the category of not quite. Her eyes were the first specific thing Elliot registered, because they were the kind of eyes that registered first, large and set wide. The irises not any single color but a slow movement between colors, like the surface of deep water when light is doing something interesting to it. She had 4 fingers on each hand, though Elliot would not consciously notice this for another 40 minutes, because his brain had already hit its unusual information quota and was managing its resources. She looked at him. He was still on his knees in the path. This was not the greeting posture he would have chosen had he been given any preparation time whatsoever. The translator implant behind his ear made a sound he had never heard it make before. It was a sound of effort, a brief, grinding recalibration, like a machine asked to run a program it had the components for but had never been specifically trained on. Then it went quiet. Then, after a pause long enough to accumulate its own small awkwardness, it delivered her first words to him. What she said, the translator rendered as, "Your animal, he would not leave me." The syntax was formal in a way that felt architectural, like a building that had been constructed according to rules the current era had mostly stopped using. Eliot's translator had been calibrated for 9 of the 17 registered dialects in the Outreach Bravo contact zone, and whatever she was speaking, it was finding the right approximation slowly, with care, the way you might handle something old that you wanted to get right. She said it with the neutrality of a person delivering a factual report, and it was a very good performance of neutrality. And underneath it, there was something that sounded like a person who had recently been through something and had decided, with some effort, to be finished with it. The translator was not sophisticated enough to carry all of that. Elliot heard it anyway. He stood up. He was aware that he was in his socks, that he had slept in his clothes, that he had last looked in a mirror sometime before the word crisis had become accurate for his situation, and that none of this was the point. He looked at the woman on his path, who was injured and exhausted, and had apparently arrived here by following his dog through several days of terrain that the settlement search coordinator had described as statistically unkind to warm-blooded life forms. "Would you like to come inside?" he said. It was not quite a question. He was not sure what it was, exactly, an offering maybe. An acknowledgement that whatever came next was going to be handled better with a roof over it. Copper was already walking her in. She sat at his kitchen table with the posture of someone who had decided that sitting down was a temporary concession to circumstance, and not a commentary on her general condition. And she accepted the emergency medkit with a gracious nod that managed to convey both genuine gratitude and the implication that she had, at various points in her life, had access to considerably more sophisticated medical equipment. Elliot did not take this personally. He set the medkit on the table, showed her the basic sealing patches for the cut along her forearm, and then retreated to the kitchen unit to make coffee, because making coffee was something he knew how to do, and the last 40 minutes had contained a significant quantity of things he did not. The coffee he could offer her was synthetic. Everything on Cathara 7 was either synthesized, shipped at enormous expense, or grown in the colony's agricultural module by a botanist named Wessler who took his work very seriously, and whose tomatoes had won 3 consecutive settlement awards, and who did not, to Elliot's knowledge, grow coffee. He set a cup in front of her. She looked at it with the specific expression of a person being introduced to a substance they have been told is a beverage and are choosing to believe. She took a sip. Something moved across her face that the translator could not help with. "It is warm," she said, which was either a diplomatic observation or the kindest thing she could find to say, and Elliot decided it was probably both. Her name arrived in pieces, the translator working carefully around the formal register of her speech the way you might work around furniture in an unfamiliar room. "Thessara an Velith," she told him, of the Velen Compact. She said it as context, not announcement, the name of the institution behind the person, offered the way you offer the name of the town you grew up in when someone has just found you lost in a ditch. Elliot told her his name and his function, and the name of the settlement, and the translator delivered all of it. He suspected, with slightly more importance than it warranted, because translations tended to formalize things and logistics coordinator sounded, rendered into a sufficiently archaic register, like it could mean almost anything. The crash, she explained, had been an atmospheric navigation failure. Her personal transit craft had entered Cathara 7 upper weather system during a pressure differential event that the craft's guidance matrix had attempted to correct for, and then, she paused here, looking for the word, had decided to stop correcting for. This was the most precise translation the implant could produce. Elliot was reasonably certain it meant the ship had gone down, but the phrasing had the quality of a very polished euphemism that had survived the translation intact, which he found oddly impressive. She had been walking for 2 days when Copper found her. She said this the way she said most things, with a flatness that was not coldness but precision, the language of someone who has learned to report rather than narrate because reporting is what gets things done. But she stopped after it briefly, in the specific way of someone who has bumped against a memory they were not expecting to be where it was. Copper, who had been sitting with his shoulder pressed against her left leg since approximately the moment she sat down, made no acknowledgement of this pause. He simply remained there, warm and certain and immovable, the way he had apparently been for the past 3 days, which was beginning to strike Elliot as less like a dog's behavior and more like a policy decision. She had used her last emergency thermal patch on the second night, she told him. The eastern ridge at night ran cold enough to be serious about it, and the terrain did not encourage moving in the dark, and she had sat down in the shelter of an overhang to wait for light that was still several hours away. And then there had been a sound in the dark, which, on Cathara 7, was not by itself a reassuring development. And then there had been a warm weight against her side that was not the rock face and was breathing, and which, when she turned to assess it, turned out to be a large rust-colored dog who looked at her with amber eyes and did not appear to consider the situation unusual in any way. Elliot looked at Copper. Copper looked at the middle distance with the expression of a dog not currently seeking praise but willing to accept it. She had followed him because there was nothing else to do, and also because, she said, after a brief pause that the translator handled with its customary elimination of subtext, he had not given her the impression that not following was available as an option. Elliot nodded. This was accurate. He had seen Copper decide that something needed to happen and had observed, on multiple occasions, that the dog's interpretation of the word optional did not align with standard usage. It was while he was absorbing all of this, the crash, the ridge, the 2 days of walking, the dog who had apparently conducted a solo search and rescue operation while every official alert in the settlement net was pointing people in the wrong direction, that his wall panel began to make noise. It chirped once, then twice. Then it emitted the kind of continuous multi-frequency alert that Elliot associated with supply emergencies, and the one time a Class 2 atmospheric inversion had rolled in from the northern ridge, and the colony's weather system had expressed its feelings about this by activating every alarm simultaneously for 45 minutes. He looked at the panel. The panel was displaying more active communication threads than he had ever seen it display at once, and in the center of all of it, expanding to fill the screen with the automatic priority override of a first-tier diplomatic broadcast, was a seal he did not recognize, gold and geometrically complex, and accompanied by an escalating tone that Copper, on the floor, regarded with one raised ear and a posture that indicated readiness to have opinions about it. The translation scrolled beneath the seal in 3 languages, his implant catching up half a second later. Sector-wide search operation, priority diplomatic classification, Minister THESSARA when NVLETH of the VLAN Compact Trade Directorate, missing following navigational incident. All vessels, installations, and settlements in KETHARA sector requested to report any contact or information immediately. Elliot read it once. He read it again more slowly, on the theory that the second reading might produce a different result. It did not. He turned from the wall panel to the woman sitting at his kitchen table with a medkit sealing patch on her forearm and a cup of synthetic coffee she was enduring with quiet dignity. She met his eyes with an expression that was, for the first time since she had come through his door, not quite composed, not distressed, exactly, but carrying the specific look of a person who had known this moment was coming and had been hoping it would arrive after she finished the coffee. "Trade Minister," Elliot said. The translator delivered this in her direction with perfect fidelity to his tone, which he would have preferred it not do. She straightened in the chair. It was a small movement that accomplished a great deal. "Yes," she said, in the formal archaic register that his translator had now mostly learned to navigate. "That is what I am." There was a silence. On the floor, Copper thumped his tail once against the tiles, with the unhurried confidence of an animal who had known this the whole time and did not consider it a complication. The message Elliot sent to the Colonial Administration Office took him 4 attempts to write and 11 minutes to send, and the delay had nothing to do with the wording, which was by the third draft perfectly clear, and everything to do with the fact that each time he moved his finger toward the transmit key, he looked at Copper asleep on the floor with his head resting on Thesara's foot, and he felt the specific hesitation of a man who understands that some actions, once taken, reorganize things permanently. He sent it on the 4th attempt by simply not looking at the floor. The administration office responded in 6 minutes with a reply that consisted almost entirely of capitalized words and exclamation notations, which was how bureaucratic systems express the emotion they were not architecturally designed to feel. The compact diplomatic craft arrived 3 hours and 40 minutes later, which Elliot considered extraordinary given that sector-wide meant the search had presumably extended across several 100,000 kilometers of monitored space, and which Thesara received with the equanimity of someone accustomed to organizations that moved quickly when sufficiently alarmed. There were 2 ships. They were the kind of vessels that made everything parked near them look like it was still forming an opinion about whether to be a ship. They settled onto the eastern landing flat with a silence that was itself a kind of statement, and the officials who descended from them were dressed in compact formal registry colors and moved with the coordinated precision of people who had rehearsed this reunion in their heads during a very tense 3-hour flight. Elliot watched from the porch. Thesara stood at the top of the path to receive them, and she had done something with her remaining intact clothing that transformed it from wreckage into intention. And she held herself the way she had held herself in his kitchen, once she remembered who she was, as though the torn sleeve and the medkit patch on her forearm were details she had chosen rather than acquired, which Elliot suspected was less a performance than an actual skill that certain people developed, and that he personally did not possess and had made his peace with. Copper stood beside her. He had not been asked. He had simply stood up when she moved toward the door and positioned himself at her left side with the focused composure of a dog who has assessed the situation and determined where he needs to be. The lead official came forward with both hands extended in what the translator rendered as a greeting of the first relief category, and Copper inserted himself between them with a movement so smooth and so absolute that the official stopped mid-stride and stood holding his hands out to no one, looking at the dog with the expression of a man consulting an internal protocol document that did not have a relevant entry. There was a moment. Thesara looked down at Copper. Copper looked up at Thesara. Neither of them moved. The official waited with the patience of someone who has been in diplomatic situations before and understands that sometimes you simply wait until the situation clarifies itself. It was, when Elliot described it later to Dara from the adjacent supply unit, the most authority he had ever seen a dog exercise in a formal context without barking once. The rest of the day was paperwork, which was its own kind of science fiction. The compact's diplomatic documentation protocols having been designed by people who believed that the correct response to any significant event was to produce enough written record of it to constitute a small archive. Elliot moved through it patiently, signing things and confirming things and sitting across from a compact official, named something his translator rendered as Vurath, who asked him the same question in 5 different formulations, apparently hoping that one of them would produce an answer that fit better into the relevant form. No, Elliot explained, the dog had not been operating under any authorized search mandate. No, there was no formal arrangement between Outreach Bravo and the Velen Compact that would account for the contact. No, he had not known who she was. Yes, he understood that harboring a first-tier diplomatic official, even inadvertently, even at the invitation of a retriever, carried formal implications. Vurath wrote everything down with the dedication of someone who found writing things down genuinely satisfying, and Elliot decided that this was actually fine, because at least one of them was enjoying the afternoon. Somewhere in the middle of the third form, Thesara came to find him. She came around the side of the supply shed where he had retreated to give the officials the landing flat, and she was not wearing the composure she had worn for the greeting, not because she had lost it, but because she had put it somewhere else, deliberately, the way you set down something you have been carrying for a long time when you reach a place where it is safe to do so. She stood in front of him in the pale late light of Kethara 7 long afternoon, and she looked, for the first time since his door had opened that morning, like someone who had been through 3 days in the wilderness and was no longer managing the fact away. She said, "He did not leave me." The translator delivered it plainly, stripped of register, and it arrived that way, plain and exact and carrying the full weight of what it meant. 3 valleys over, in the cold that was serious about itself, in the dark that Kethara 7 Eastern Ridge produced with total commitment, when she had stopped because she could not walk further. A dog she had never met had lain down beside her and stayed. Not because he had been commanded to, and not because the terrain permitted him to do anything else, but because, as far as Elliot could determine, Copper had looked at the situation and arrived at a conclusion that did not include leaving. Elliot looked at the dog, who had followed them both around the side of the supply shed and was now sitting between them on the clay-colored ground, tail moving in a slow, contented arc. "He doesn't really leave people," Elliot said. It was the truest thing he knew about his dog, and it had taken him 2 years and a missing animal alert and a sector-wide diplomatic incident to understand that this was not a personality trait, but a practice. Something Copper did with the consistency of someone who had worked out the right way to be in the world and was applying it without making a fuss about it. Elliot had spent 3 days preparing to lose him and had spent the whole time missing the point, which was that Copper had not been lost. Copper had been busy. The ships lifted at 800 the following morning. Elliot stood on the landing flat with his hands in his jacket pockets, and Copper stood beside him, and they watched the compact vessels rise without a sound through Kethara 7 lower atmosphere and become, very quickly, nothing visible. Copper watched until there was nothing left to watch, and then he turned and walked back toward the house at the pace of a dog who has finished one thing and is ready to begin the next. And Elliot followed him because that had always been, when he thought about it honestly, the correct direction to go. The communiqué arrived 3 days later. It bore the compact's first-tier diplomatic seal in gold, and it was addressed to Elliot Voss of Outreach Bravo, and also, separately and specifically, to Copper, listed by his full name with the spelling verified against the Colonial Animal Registry, a detail that suggested someone had made a specific effort. It was signed by Thesara Anvilith, in her own hand, requesting the honor of a formal introduction visit at the earliest mutual convenience. Elliot read it at the kitchen table with a cup of synthetic coffee that was, as always, warm rather than good, and he read it twice, and then he set it down and looked at Copper, who was sitting in the patch of light that came through the east window every morning at this hour, and who looked back at him with the amber-eyed patience of an animal who had never, not once, doubted how any of this was going to go. Outside, Cathara 7 was doing something interesting with its clouds. The twin moons would cross tonight. The eastern ridge was rust-colored and enormous and largely indifferent to the small good life arranged at its feet. The man, the house, the dog in the light, and somewhere above the atmosphere, accelerating now through the Cathara sector toward the wider and stranger universe beyond it. A trade minister carrying 3 days of clay and cold, and the memory of a warm weight in the dark that had not, for a single moment, considered leaving her there alone,